Last episode, I revived an old ROV for a client after its watertight cylinder decided to crack itself open. But today's mission takes us to the sky. The DJI Mini3 lost its front arm after my son tested the drone's compatibility with trees. Turns out, they're not compatible. So let's fix this little guy and get him flying again. Preferably far, far away from trees. Now remove all the screws using a Phillips and a Torx driver. And keep those screws safe, because if even one goes missing, you'll spend the rest of the day crawling on the floor questioning your life choices. Next, I use a small plastic pry tool to open the lower shell. This thing is so thin and precisely made that I'm genuinely worried about snapping one of those tiny internal clips. It even brings back memories of the early 2000s, when cracking open a phone just to explore its circuit board felt like an adventure. Now for the screws on the top shell. These two are hiding behind a camera gimbal, and getting them out is, let's just say, not fun. So take it slow. One wrong move, and they'll vanish into another dimension. Next, I remove the screw holding the broken arm to the pivot shaft, pull the arm out, and check whether the shaft took any damage. Thankfully, the shaft is completely fine, because if it wasn't, this repair would have gone from simple fix to why is this my life today. Now I start removing the top shell. The internal clips are so tight that the plastic pry tool doesn't even make them flinch, so I have to bring in a tiny metal spudger. But hey, after a bit of gentle persuasion, the top shell finally pops open. Now it's time to take apart the internal electronics. First, I remove the GPS module inside the top shell, gently taking out the two tiny screws and lifting the module out with care. And don't forget the microscopic connector on the back of the GPS module. That little guy loves to hide. Next, I remove the optical flow module inside the lower shell. After taking out the 4 screws, don't rush to pull the module out. First, disconnect the tiny micro connector on it. You have to carefully peel off the little glue block holding it in place. And trust me, this part requires maximum patience if you don't want to destroy the connector. Next, I shift the ESC module, not removing it, just moving it to a better spot for soldering. After taking out the 3 screws inside the battery compartment, I disconnect the tiny connector on the ESC, and just like the others, this connector also has a little glue block on it. So I carefully peel that off before unplugging anything. After moving the ESC module out of the way, I start preparing to remove the broken arm. First, I unplug the tiny coaxial connector for the communication antenna on the main board, carefully peeling off the little glue block on top before disconnecting it. Then I free the antenna feed line from inside the shell so it doesn't get caught on anything. Now comes the hardest part, removing the 3 motor wires for the damaged arm from the ESC module. All the wires are soldered directly onto their pads, and there's a thick layer of glue covering everything. Peeling off that glue requires maximum patience. You really don't want to damage the solder pads or any of the tiny components sitting right next to them. With the damaged arm finally removed, it's time for the new arm to make its grand entrance. Well, new might be an overstatement. This one is a cut wire version, basically an arm from a drone whose motor had failed. It's much cheaper than buying a full arm with a motor, and since my original motor is still perfectly fine, this swap saves a nice chunk of money. The new arm needs a bit of modification. Since the cut wire section is right at the motor base, it still has some leftover enamel-coated wires attached. I remove those first, then take the original motor off the old arm, strip its wires, and solder them onto the new arm's fresh cable set. And one important warning, Never pull all the cables out of the new arm. Once they come out, there's no way you're getting them back in. After soldering the original motor wires, I slide on a thin micro heat shrink tube for insulation. If the tubing is too thick, the cable won't fit back into the arm, so thin is the only way to go. And before pulling the cable back in, I add a bit of silicone grease to the heat shrink. Makes the whole process much smoother. Once the wires are back in place, I secure the motor with its screws and reapply the little PVC sticker over the screw holes. The final step in modifying the new arm is at the joint where it connects to the pivot shaft. All the wires need to be gathered together and covered with a heat shrink tube because this area rotates frequently. Without that protective tubing, the wires would wear out or even break much sooner than you'd like. Now it's time to put everything back together. First, I reinstall the new arm and solder its wires onto the ESC board, making absolutely sure the wire order is correct. After soldering, I clean the joints, check for any shorts with a multimeter, and once everything looks good, I apply insulating glue over the solder points on the ESC. Next, I route the communication antenna feed line inside the new arm back through its original path. Then I reconnect the tiny LED indicator plug from the arm back onto the ESC board. After tidying up all the wires on the ESC, I place the ESC module back into its original position and tighten the screws to secure it. Don't forget the tiny signal connector on the ESC. If that one isn't plugged in, the drone simply won't work. Once it's connected, I apply a layer of insulating glue on top to keep it secured. Then I reconnect the micro coaxial plug of the communication antenna back to the main board, and again add a bit of insulating glue to hold it in place. I don't have the hard glue block DJI uses on the main board, so insulating glue is my substitute. It cures firmly enough to secure both ends of the connector, yet can still be removed easily when needed. Now I reinstall the GPS module. Don't forget the tiny connector on the back. Once that's plugged in, I tighten the 4 screws to secure the module in place. Next, I reinstall the optical flow module. Same rule as always. Don't forget that tiny connector before tightening everything down. You can really see how DJI borrowed ideas from modern smartphones. Many of the internal modules and connectors look just like phone components. It's a clever approach that saves both space and weight. With the screws tightened, the tiny connector plugged in, and a fresh layer of insulating glue applied, it's finally time to close the lown and top shells. And the sound they make when snapping together. It's oddly satisfying, like the drone is telling me I'm whole again. The final step is simple. Reinstall the screws that hold the top and lounge shells together and tighten them down. That's the last click before the drone is officially rebuilt. Now I reinstall the propeller onto the motor of the newly replaced arm and secure the bolt with a bit of low-strength thread locker. Just enough to keep it tight, but not so much that I can't remove it later. With the shell cleaned up, I move on to the desk test. Power on. Hold the drone down with one hand. Gently push the throttle. and my eyes lock onto that motor like a parent watching their kid's first school performance. If it spins smoothly, perfect. If it twitches or hesitates, well, that's when I pretend it's all part of my advanced diagnostic procedure. The motor wiring looks good and everything runs smoothly, so it's time for the outdoor flight test. Now let's see if the antenna signal behaves, or if it decides to surprise me in the most inconvenient way possible. At this point, we can officially say this Mini 3 is back to full health. Thanks for watching, and I hope you'll like and subscribe. Your support really is what keeps me going. Merry Christmas, and I wish all of you a wonderful holiday season.